Before I start this video, I would like to point out that despite the fact I am working on getting a degree in philosophy, I am not an absolute expert on everything. And while I've done my research, I don't take me to be an exact, complete authority in philosophy. Do your own research if you'd like, check sources, and basically just don't use me as a study guide. Alright, let's begin. I'll start it off with a question. Here's the question for you. What do you use each and every day and are even using right now to try and answer this question? The answer is logic. Logic helps most everything in our human world, from governments and politicians to the economy to even your body itself, but logic is misunderstood by many. If asked what logic is, many would probably respond with its colloquial definition that logic is just coming to a conclusion using facts. But that doesn't even hold a candle to the realm of logical philosophy. To explore logical philosophy, let's start at the beginning. And when I say the beginning, I really mean the beginning, back in Athens in ancient Greece. Despite the fact that quote-unquote philosophers existed before him, there is one man who is so prominent in the realm of philosophy that every other philosopher, past, present, and future, would be defined by and categorized by whether they started before or after him. That man was Socrates. Socrates is viewed by many as the first true Western philosopher, and is often dubbed the father of Western philosophy. He held many views about many things, such as that harming anyone in any situation, even as revenge, retribution, repaying, etc., was wrong. However, despite Socrates' reportedly calm and collected demeanor, as well as his peaceful ideologies, Socrates had a good few enemies, and unfortunately many of those enemies were some of the most powerful people in Athens. You might think that the term the most powerful people in Athens is impossible, because Athens had a direct democracy, so it's one in which every law and every political decision had to go through every person through a vote, meaning that technically everyone had an equal say, and therefore everyone would be just as powerful as each other. But this equality did not last forever. Since Athens was a warrior society, one that often went to war with others, and that they had a strong military, it meant that in their many conquests, they often reigned victorious, and then would bring the spoils back to Athens. This meant there was a lot of wealth going around in Athens, and as money is, some people have more of it than others. So basically, despite the fact that everyone technically had an equal say, not many people wanted to go against the others that had so much money and influence, meaning those people inadvertently became quote-unquote powerful. So, how did Socrates, of all people, make enemies of so many of them? Well, it had to do with a particular habit of his, one called the elenchus. Essentially, Socrates would seek out Athenians who were regarded as wise or in high esteem, and would question them on their thoughts and beliefs, going down a rabbit hole of debate and questioning that would eventually really lead to almost always showing that said person's beliefs were not logically founded by anything. And yeah. Well, here's the thing. Despite the fact that Socrates did this in pursuit of understanding, being that he held the infamous view that all he knew was that he knew nothing, those he questioned were enraged at Socrates, believing he made them out to be a fool. You know, he made them out to look stupid and not wise, a fool. And because Socrates sought out people who were in high esteem and position, these people were also usually some of the most powerful people in Athens, meaning that they really, really did not like him. However, the public's tension only ever came to a break when finally they saw that Socrates, in their eyes, appeared to question their gods. It started with one oracle, in particular, the Oracle of Delphi. Oracles in ancient Greek culture were people believed the gods spoke through them. So they were held in extremely high regard because of Athens and ancient Greeks' immensely religious culture. Essentially, the Oracle of Delphi was asked, who is the wisest man in Athens? The oracle responded, Socrates. Now, Socrates, upon hearing this, was not delighted, as you might expect. He actually was quite sort of questionable. He did not really think that this could be true. In fact, he thought it was pretty much impossible because he still had held that belief that all he knew was that he knew nothing. So how could he, someone who knew nothing, be the wisest man in Athens? So he began to question it. And when people saw this, because they believed that the gods spoke through the oracle, they saw Socrates as questioning their gods. So they imprisoned him on charges of atheism and corrupting the youth. There is a text that details Socrates' trial and aftermath and everything called The Apology in Crito and the Trial and Death of Socrates, written by Plato, and I highly recommend giving them a read. The people accuse Socrates of many things, such as being a nature philosopher. Nature philosophers were more atheistic, pre-Socratic philosophers who looked for natural reasonings and explanations for things that people took to be godly, and as such, they weren't really held in that high regard as you might expect. Socrates, however, denied this claim. Socrates was also labeled by the court as a sophist. Sophists were a contentious group in ancient Greece. They were people who taught people virtue and excellence, which included formulation of arguments and persuasion. As with direct democracy, the ability to persuade others is an extremely powerful and important tool, because once you've convinced and persuaded the people of something, you're home free. They vote on it, you've won. Sophists accepted money in exchange for their teachings, and many congregated to Athens due to the fact that its democracy would provide a high demand for sophists, and that Athens had plenty of wealth, meaning they were able to make good pay. However, despite that they had an influential role, a lot of people didn't exactly like the sophists because they didn't really teach how to make a good argument, they just taught how to make an argument. Essentially, what upset the people of Athens so much was that sophists could teach someone how to make a bad argument and a bad idea look like a good one, which was worrisome to them. Socrates, however, disagreed with this assessment that he was supposedly a sophist, claiming he did not teach exactly what or as a sophist did, nor did he accept pay for it, something that was looked down upon by other Athenians because they saw the sophist taking money for an act they saw as unjust. However, Socrates was unable to convince the people, and he was eventually sentenced to death, eventually having to drink poison in an act depicted in the famous painting, The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David. However, Socrates' legacy did not die with him, as his students continued on philosophizing. One of Socrates' most famous students was Plato, who would continue to use Socrates as a character in fictional dialogues, which were texts that displayed philosophical beliefs and ideas in a narrative form, with characters, people talking, a story, etc. Plato would then, playing it safer than Socrates by avoiding real-life use of the elenchus in favor of writing fictional dialogue to make his points so as not to be as likely to be publicly vilified, teach his own students. Here we get to the founder of logical philosophy, Plato's student Aristotle. Aristotle was actually a student of Plato. A lot of people don't know that. But Aristotle would, as his teacher Plato did, write down his philosophical beliefs, although Aristotle's texts in particular are actually quite infamously difficult to read, as it is believed his philosophical texts were actually just his lecture notes and not formatted for public consumption. One of these texts written by Aristotle was his work, The Organon, and in The Organon, Aristotle founded the realm of logical philosophy. Aristotle discusses his and my favorite form of reasoning, deductive reasoning. First, Aristotle creates what is called a syllogism, which is essentially an equation for an argument. Every statement in the syllogism is a form of proposition. Everything to the left of the equal sign is a premise, and everything to the right of the equal sign is the conclusion. So, for an example, the idea of a syllogism is that the premises add up to a conclusion, such as the premise, fruit grows on trees, plus the premise, apples grow on trees, equals the conclusion, apples are fruit. Aristotle defines deductive reasoning as reasoning that goes from general premises to specific conclusions. Essentially, for example, imagine you're in a field holding a bouncy ball, and you wonder, if I throw this bouncy ball in the air, will it come back down? So, using deductive reasoning, you could formulate it as such. First, a general premise, that the gravity pulls objects to the Earth's surface. Then, another general premise, that bouncy balls are objects. So, you come to a specific conclusion that because of these general premises, this bouncy ball will come back down if I throw it. Aristotle believed this to be the best method of reasoning, and however, there would be one who would eventually disagree with him. That person would be Francis Bacon, an English philosopher who lived between the 15 and 1600s. Bacon disagreed with Aristotle's assessment of reasoning, and in a power move of sorts, because Aristotle's book on logical philosophy was named the Organon, Bacon named his book the New Organon. In it, Bacon describes a few things, one such thing being what he calls the 4 idols of the mind, 4 factors which Bacon says impacts our ability to reason. These 4 idols include the idol of the cave, named in reference to Plato's allegory of the cave. Used in Plato's work The Republic as an attempt to back up Plato's theory of forms, the idea that everything has a true and perfect form on some other plane of existence, which is kind of baloney if you ask me, Bacon simply names the idol after the cave, the idol of the cave after the allegory of the cave, just for the story, not the underlying reasons. In the allegory of the cave, prisoners are chained up in a cave from birth, only able to see a wall in which shadows of the objects passing the cave's entrance would be cast onto it. Because they had only been able to see this wall and these shadows from birth, they have no idea that there is something real out there casting those shadows. To them, the shadows are the real deal. That's all there is. They're real. However, when one prisoner gets freed and goes out to see that, in fact, the shadows aren't real, they're just distortions, they're just projections of a real thing that's outside their cave, when he comes back to tell his other prisoners, they are so enraged that he questioned their worldview that they even try and kill him. Francis Bacon names the idol of the cave after the allegory because the idol of the cave says that we all have our own caves which distort the light of nature. Much how these prisoners think that the shadows of the real objects are the real thing, we all have our own subjective world and our biases in our own head that take the objective world around us and filter it and subjectify it. So we all have our own caves that basically filter and distort the light of nature. Bacon's next idol is the idol of the tribe, which basically says that we have this false belief that human sense is the best sense. Next is the idol of the marketplace, which states that human language isn't and will never be good enough to communicate inner truths. For example, there is an infamous psychological property that humans may see different colors than each other. For example, the color you call blue might actually be the color that I call red. But we've simply just learned to call it blue. According to the idol of the marketplace, language would never be good enough to communicate an inner truth like that. As in, I could never actually tell by discussing with you whether or not your blue truly was my red, for example. Bacon's next idol is the idol of the theater, which is that people go through their lives acting as if established systems of knowledge were true, which is not the case in many situations, and leads to us acting in ways that aren't really the most logical, but we're just acting in accordance to these established systems of knowledge. Like, for example, back in the day, everyone thought the earth was flat. People went through their whole lives, the world worked in a way where everyone went about their lives acting as if the earth was flat. However, it was round, not flat, but people went through their lives acting as if it was flat because that was what the established system of knowledge was at the time. Bacon, having defined his 4 idols of the mind, which he believes affects how we think and reason, he then opposes Aristotle's assertion that deductive reasoning is best, instead arguing for what is called inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is the opposite of deductive reasoning, going from specific premises to general conclusions. For example, going back to the bouncy ball hypothetical, if you want to know if it'll come back to your hand and you use inductive reasoning, you would do something like this. You throw the ball in the air once and it comes back down. You throw the ball in the air a second time and it comes back down. You throw the ball in the air a third time and it comes back down. Because of these specific instances, you come to a general conclusion that bouncy balls come back down when thrown. However, there is an issue with inductive reasoning, which the 1700 Scottish philosopher David Hume defined as the problem of induction in his work, An Enquiry into Human Understanding. Hume describes this problem essentially as such, which, by the way, for the sake of length and conciseness, I am not discussing his argument about matters of facts, relations of ideas, etc., which he uses to prove his point and come up to this point and a lot of other things. This is very simplified. Okay, so Hume's problem of induction essentially goes like this. Every single usage of inductive reasoning has a hidden premise. Because, such as in the bouncy ball hypothetical just stated, you go from specific past instances to come to a general conclusion in the present. That must mean that all uses of inductive reasoning have a hidden premise that says the future will be like the past. Because if they didn't have this hidden premise, then inductive reasoning would be futile, because you would have no reason to believe that these specific past instances hold any bearing on what the future will be like. Hume then goes on to describe what the hidden premise and why the premise, known as the uniformity of nature principle, is flawed. He claims there is no basis to believe that the uniformity of nature principle is true. Essentially, that there is no basis to believe that the future will be like the past with 100% absolute certainty. Essentially, Hume says that because you can't prove that the future won't be like the past, this means that the assertion that the future will definitely be like the past is invalid. Hume then says that if one were to say that the future will be like the past, because in the past the future has always been like the past, you would be using a circular argument. Because you can't use that in the past the future has been like the past to prove that the future will be like the past, because that requires that the future will be like the past, which is what you're trying to prove. So it's circular. Again, as a side note, this is a greatly simplified, condensed, and cut down version of his argument, and I may do a deeper examination in a future video. So, because Hume has proven that all inductive reasoning contains a flawed premise, this means that all inductive reasoning is invalid in its use. Moving forward in time, in 1800s Cambridge, Massachusetts, we would get the third and final form of reasoning provided by a philosopher and mathematician known as Charles Sanders Peirce. This form of reasoning is known as abductive reasoning or best guess reasoning. Essentially, abductive reasoning is the use of certain philosophical and logical tools in order to come to the best guess about something. For example, imagine you're walking in an alleyway and all of a sudden, boom, you feel something hit your head hard. You're stunned for a moment, but when you come to, you look around to try and figure out what happened. Beside you on the ground, you see a brick with blood on it, on the cracked sidewalk. This brick wasn't there before. You then look up and see above your head there is an active construction site for a brick building with bricks being hauled around. You then come to the best guess conclusion that a brick fell from the site and hit you on the head. Abductive reasoning relies on the use of logical instruments to come to these best guesses, as it doesn't actually work exactly through the way deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning does, where they have an equation. Abductive reasoning works much more on speculation, so it requires the use of tools to sort of piece together the best guess. One of these, and perhaps the most important tool for abductive reasoning, is Occam's razor, defined by the 12th century philosopher Sir William of Ockham from the UK. So, essentially, Occam's razor is one of a few logical tools that are named after sharp objects, such as Hume's guillotine. Hume's guillotine, created by the aforementioned David Hume, is essentially a logical device that says just because something is doesn't mean it should be, in refute to naturalists, which were people who say that things that are natural are good. And so Hume's guillotine basically says, if you're about to say that something's good because it's natural, because it is, cut that off right there, like a guillotine. Cut off your argument, because just because something is doesn't mean it should be. Occam's razor is one of those sharp object logical devices for the same reason. It's designed to cut off an argument at a specific point, or cut off a line of reasoning. It basically says that the simplest answer is usually the right one. For example, imagine that you come home from work and find your child in your living room standing next to a broken vase. You ask your child what happened to the vase, and he says a cat broke it. But you don't own a cat, so you ask him where this cat came from. They say that, well, the cat came in the door, but the door was locked. You ask how the door was open, etc., etc., etc. You go down this rabbit hole, this snowball of reasoning, which requires a huge amount of steps to believe. However, the simplest answer, the one that requires the least amount of steps, is most likely the best one. That your child broke the vase. After all, they were here all day, they're rowdy, they're young, they're clumsy, they've broken things before, and most of all, they're standing right next to it. It requires very few steps to believe, and therefore is the simplest and most likely. So, this is where we end our lesson on logical philosophy. Remember, this video is heavily simplified, and I implore you to use your own research, and I'm not an authority in philosophy. So I urge you to use this as just entertainment, maybe a bit of info, and not as a study guide of any sort. And I hope you enjoyed.